Welcome to our third and last day of Exalted Spirits. Thank you for all the participants and the attendees for making this such an invigorating, intellectually invigorating conference. And before we start today, I just wanted to encourage those who have not done this yet to go visit the exhibition Exalted Spirits at the Egyptian Museum. It's in Gallery R44. Our morning session today complements perfectly well some of the talks you've heard yesterday. We heard a discussion of al-bayt and the veneration practices related to them in 3 wonderful presentations. And there's nothing better than to start the day with a discussion of prophetic relics in Cairo. Please join me in welcoming Iman Abdulfattah.
Good morning. Sabah al-khair. Oh God, that is so loud. So a couple of things that I'd like to say before I begin. There's a little bit of nepotism here because I was introduced by a very dear friend, and the whole idea of this conference and exhibition was curated and crafted by another dear friend. And so that's something that I would like to acknowledge. The second thing is that this is my alma mater. I spent my junior year here as an undergraduate, and I also received my master's from AUC, but this is the first time that I'm ever up on the stage in Ewart Hall. So it's kind of a nice way to return. So, can you hear me? Great. So when thinking about different practices of veneration in Egypt over the longue durée, preserving the memory of the Prophet Muhammad was a consistent theme during the medieval period. This was achieved in several ways, of which I will focus on the culture of celebrating him and related virtuous figures that resulted in the building of shrines and collecting of relics. Commemorating his memory in Egypt can be traced back to the early 9th century, when al-Sayyida Nafisa, a direct descendant, settled in Fustat. She was known for her piety, interpretation of the Quran, developed a reputation for learning and performing miracles, and was respected greatly by her contemporary, al-Imam al-Shafi'i. When in 824 she sensed the proximity of her death, she reportedly dug a grave in her house following the sunnah. In his Khitat, the 15th century Mamluk historian al-Maqrizi wrote that her burial place became known as a source of barakah and where supplications were answered. Frequent visitation to her grave, or ziyarah, greatly contributed to the expansion of Al-Qarafa Cemetery, which you see it's encircled there surrounding the shrine of Imam al-Shafi'i. Between 1122 and 1154, Fatimid Shia elite furthered this tradition by restoring or commissioning several shrines dedicated to members of Ahl al-Bayt, including Mashahid Ru'ya, or shrines that were built in response to dream visions. As per Caroline Williams, the 5 shrines in red were either restored or built in 1122 by the Fatimid vizier al-Ma'mun al-Bata'ihi, and they honored descendants of Ja'far al-Sadiq. And for those of you who don't know, Ja'far al-Sadiq was a descendant of Ali and Fatima through their son al-Hussein. And he was also the 6th Imam of the 12er branch of Shia Islam, as well as a major figure in Sufi Quranic exegesis. The remaining 4 shrines, the ones that are highlighted in green, were built between 1133 and 1150. Now, following the building of the last of these shrines and 2 decades before the end of Fatimid rule in 1171, the head of al-Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's grandson, who was beheaded in the Battle of Karbala in Iraq, was transferred to Cairo. According to this version of the story, the Abbasids confiscated the head of al-Hussein upon unseating the Umayyads in 750, and they secretly transferred it to the city of Ascalon on the coast of Palestine. The purpose behind the relocation of the head by the Abbasids was a desire to prevent pilgrims from visiting it. A shrine was subsequently built to house the head by the Fatimid vizier Badr Jamali in the year 1098, until it was transferred to Cairo again, until it was transferred again to Cairo in 1154 by another Fatimid Fatimid vizier named the Salah Tala'a. And this was done to safeguard the head from the conquering Frankish crusaders. Now, I say this version of the story because some Muslims believe that the head is kept in Damascus. Now, many of you are Cairenes and you're familiar with the Mosque of Salah Tala'a. It's right outside of Bab Zuwayla. What you might not know is that the Mosque of Salah Tala'a was originally conceived of as a repository to house the head of al-Hussein when it was brought to Cairo. Its intended use as a shrine for a Shia martyr might explain the incorporation of this entrance portico, a feature which to my knowledge was unrepeated in Cairo's mosques. Instead, Caliph al-Faiz kept the relic in a shrine, in another shrine, connected to the Greater Eastern Palace, making that shrine the first within the royal enclosure instead of al-Qarafa, which was customary at the time. Now, Fatimid interest in the physical remains of virtuous figures connected to the Prophet did not begin with the transfer of al-Hussein's head. For Caliph al-Hakim attempted to steal the remains of the Prophet as well as those of Caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar from Medina to reinter them in 3 shrines that he built between Cairo and Fustat, and those shrines no longer survive. In 1010, al-Hakim also reportedly brought to Cairo the personal effects of Ja'far as-Sadiq from his home in Medina. Now, in these Fatimid examples, relics, be it the attempted acquisition of corporeal remains of the Prophet and members of Ahl al-Bayt, or more significant, the commissioning and or patronage of places of veneration and repositories, like the aforementioned shrines, were used to convey power in different ways. Number 1, to expand the topography of Cairo, which allowed the city to come alive vis-a-vis their frequent visitation or ziyarah, but also their documentation in contemporaneous and near contemporaneous sources. 2, to offer tangible evidence of the Fatimid claim of descent from the Prophet, specifically as a Shia minority ruling over a Sunni majority in Egypt. But they were also erected to squash political and internal crises, such as when the Fatimid credibility and spiritual authority were undermined by succession disputes and 2 periods of assassination in this period between 1122 and 1154. So it was therefore critical to generate support and loyalty for the Imam Caliph. Finally, they were built to attract pilgrims, to reorient the Muslim world to their new capital, Cairo, which they founded in the year 969. Now, this culture continued in Egypt during the short Ayyubid period, but thrived during the first era of the Mamluk Sultanate, or the Bahri Mamluk period. Now, culturally, the Mamluks are known for historical writing, socio-religious reforms, and the massive architectural output that altered the landscape of their domain. All of this growth and achievements were meant to awe and inspire both residents and visitors alike, and contributed to Cairo's appeal as a center of trade, religion, and scholarship. It was under this tremendous and vibrant activity that a variety of relics related to the Prophet were acquired and shrines or repositories erected. Having said this, we should not ignore 2 very important traditions that prospered during the transition from Ayyubid to Mamluk rule. The first is the emergence of Sayyid Ahmad al-Badawi, a well-known Sufi ascetic who rose to prominence in Tanta when he settled there in the year 1236. He was referred to as a Sharif, an honorific title denoting his descent from the Prophet through Ali and Fatima's eldest son, al-Hassan. He was known to have performed miracles and is the eponym of the Badawiyya Sufi order. His contemporary, Sultan al-Zahir Baybars, the de facto founder of the Mamluk regime, is said to have worshipped him and kissed his feet. We could take that with a bit of grain of salt. Posthumously, a mosque was built over al-Badawi's tomb in the year 1332. The mosque status today is further enhanced by footprints of the Prophet, the most famous and public of those in Egypt, that are prominently displayed in the northwest corner across from al-Badawi's sarcophagus. So these footprints and al-Badawi's sarcophagus are in the same space. They're both under the main dome chamber. What you have are 2 large footprints of the Prophet, right and left, and they're imprinted on a single shiny black stone behind a sheet of glass. Inscribed above this small showcase is the first half of Surah Al-Ahzab. Verily, Allah and His angels shower blessings on the Prophet. In addition to these footprints, there is a modest collection of relics that are kept in a small room under lock and key. So here we have a very interesting dichotomy where the footprints are displayed and are accessible, can be accessed by the public, but the relics that are also attributed to the Prophet are not. I'm not sure what that says, but it's something that's given me a lot of thought. Now, al-Badawi remains one of the most popular saints in Egypt, and his shrine hosts the largest mulid in the country, a sign of the respect and reverence Egyptians still have for him, for the footprints and relics of the Prophet Muhammad. So much so that in the accounts and manners of customs of Egyptians, first published in the year 1836, English lexicographer and translator Edward William Lane wrote, "The tomb of the saint attracts as many visitors at the period of great festivals from the metropolis and from various parts of Lower Egypt as Mecca does pilgrims from the whole Muslim world. Many Egyptians who go to Mecca for pilgrimage go visit Tanta first." So what we can gather from this excerpt is that, or what we can deduce from this excerpt is that worshippers imagine a connection between Egypt and the Hijaz, and by extension between Ziyarah and the Hajj. And this is not unlike what the Fatimids tried to do a few centuries before by reorienting the Muslim world to Cairo. Qaitbay, another great sultan and builder of the late Circassian Mamluk period, was known to have been an admirer of al-Badawi. He renovated the mosque in the year 1483, although what you see on the bottom left here are renovations that are attributed to the 19th and 20th century. Now, interestingly, for his royal complex in Cairo's northern cemetery, Qaitbay purchased 2 sets of footprints from the Hijaz, a pair attributed to the Prophet and another to Abraham. This is not surprising, considering that Qaitbay was a very prominent sponsor of Muslim holy sites throughout the Mamluk domain, and his extensive building activities included the restoration of Cairo's shrines dedicated to Ahl al-Bayt, in addition to those in the sacred cities of Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. He's also rather complimented in the contemporaneous sources because he's one of a few Mamluk sultans to have gone on pilgrimage, and he's the only Circassian to have performed this rite. The second tradition that I want you to keep in mind is the composition of Qasidat al-Burda, the most celebrated and revered supplicatory panegyric ode composed in praise of the Prophet. Written by the celebrated Egyptian poet and scholar Imam al-Busiri, it was composed after he was cured from paralysis. And what you see here is his explanation of why he composed the Burda, and I'll summarize it for you. So, after he was cured from paralysis and upon praying to God, the Prophet appeared to al-Busiri in a dream and wrapped the poet in his mantle, Burda with a small b. When al-Busiri awoke, he was remarkably cured. The ode then became very popular because it was believed to have miraculous healing properties and thus acquired the curative qualities of the Prophet's mantle, Burda with a small b. And there were rituals attached to specific verses that were inscribed on walls or ingested. The Burda was further popularized through the numerous copies that were commissioned by elite patrons, translations into other languages, and the composition of a special kind of amplification called takhmis. And what you see here on the screen is an example of a takhmis. And takhmis, they flourished as a result of the active culture of celebrating the Prophet in Egypt. As-Sahib Baha'u'ddin ibn Henna, he was the chief vizier of Egypt under the last Ayyubid Sultan and Nasr Muhammad, and then he was reappointed by Zahir Baybars in 1261. And the chief vizier is one of the highest positions in the land. Now, As-Sahib Baha'u'ddin ibn Henna was instrumental in ensuring both al-Busiri and the Burda's success. He is mentioned in the poet's introduction to the ode, stating that when he requested a copy of it, of which he heard lots of praise, he, quote, vowed that he would not listen to it unless he was standing, barefoot with his head uncovered, and he loved to listen to it often and enjoy its blessings, he and his family, end quote. Now, Baha'u'ddin was a wealthy and generous patron, and this, together with his position and power, undoubtedly drew al-Busiri to him. For in this same introduction, al-Busiri wrote that he composed other poems in praise of the Prophet for Baha'u'ddin himself. The Banu Hinna are recognized for preserving the memory of the Prophet in other ways. As-Sahib Tajuddin ibn Hinna, he was Baha'u'ddin's grandson and also a vizier, purchased a large cache of relics from Medina, for which he built a rabat or a hospice for Sufis specifically to house them. What did these relics consist of? One of the most detailed mentions of Rabat al-Athar, as this hospice was called, is in Ibn Battuta's Rihla. During his first trip to Egypt around May 1325, he spent the night in the Rabat while en route to the Hijaz for pilgrimage. He recorded the existence of the Prophet's coal stick and all used to sew his sandals, a fragment of his bowl, and the Quran written by the hand of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Due to its popularity and importance, from the mid-14th to the early 16th century, Rabat al-Athar was the subject of several endowments and renovations. The first documented intervention was Sultan al-Ashraf Shaban's assignment of a teacher for jurists of the Shafi'i madhab and a monthly income for the teachers and the students. This was followed by Sultan Barkuk's endowment of a plot of land for a quay on the Nile that facilitated access to its pilgrim premises, most likely for visiting pilgrims. So I hope by now you see that there's a theme or there's a subtext that all of these relics, in order to be legitimate, had to be acquired from Medina, and there was a connection to pilgrimage. Now, nothing survived from Barkuk's renovation, and if you were to visit the Rabat today, it's right off of Al-Malik al-Salah's metro station. It's not directly overlooking the Nile. But this photo that's dated to 1912 gives you an idea of what that composition might have looked like, so you can get a sense of why a key would have been necessary for visiting pilgrims to access the site. Now, Ashraf Shaban had an intervention, but Sultan Barkuk had an intervention. Barkuk's son Faraj restored the Rabat again in the 15th century. There are two columns bearing his name that survive in situ in the mosque, and these two are standing in the archaeological garden of the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. Towards the end of the Circassian period in 1504, the penultimate Mamluk Sultan, Eluri, restored the mosque one more. But in addition to restoring the Rabat, he removed the relics to his mausoleum, which was built specifically to house them. Ibn Iyas, who was the historian who witnessed the advance of the Ottomans in Egypt, recounted that the transfer of these relics was celebrated with a grand procession unlike anything seen in Cairo, even though their relocation was a violation of Tajuddin's Waqf stipulation. Like the aforementioned Bahri sultans, Eluri was a great builder despite Egypt's economic and political hardships at the time. The picture painted of him in the chronicles is that of a corrupt and hedonistic monarch whose actions ultimately led to the end of 2.5 centuries of Mamluk rule. Ibn Iyas detests Eluri. I mean, that's a clear picture that you get when you read excerpts about him. Now, Eluri built his massive complex in the heart of Cairo, on either side of the main thoroughfare and processional route of the Fatimids that terminates at Al-Qarafa. To build this sprawling and imposing structure, Eluri seized and destroyed several properties, which might account for why he took the relics in the first place, to rid his complex of the terrible reputation that it had acquired. Now, the building that you see at the top half of the screen corresponding with number 67, that's the mausoleum, and the waqfiyya attached to this mausoleum says, "The tomb was prepared by the patron, whose noble name has been mentioned above. May God give him a most long and pleasant life, for the burial of himself, his children, and his harem. At the far end of the tomb, there's a noble mihrab with a marble revetted face and hood. It is flanked by 2 chests, one for the noble Quran of the Caliph Uthman, and the other for the noble relics of the Prophet Muhammad, the ones that were taken from Rabat al-Athar. Each box has a gold-colored door made from imported wood." Interestingly, across the street from Eluri's mausoleum, if I go back, right, number 189, is his mosque madrasa. Now, what's interesting about that is that verses of the Burda survive in the dikka that was specifically reserved for the Sultan. This is the same burda, that ode, that was composed under the patronage of Baha'u'ddin ibn Hinna, whose grandson Tajuddin purchased the relics that were kept in the Rabat from where Eluri seized them. So from this, one assumption that I make is that by the early 16th century, when Eluri built his complex, the burda had also acquired the status of a relic in its own right. So there's not a metaphor, but there are two kinds of relics that Eluri appropriated. Now, based on this survey, there are two practices that emerged in Egypt. Number one, relics were consumed by the pious public as devotional objects that represented the Prophet's presence and transmitted barakah. When you read the sources, you don't really, there are two impressions that I get that led me to this conclusion. One, we know that the relics that Eluri seized were hidden away, so they were not accessible by the public, but they were displayed for the public to see on certain occasions. There was a certain day, I think a Wednesday in the week, when the public could descend on the mausoleum to see these relics. Number two, both Ibli al-Shalabi and Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi, they were 17th century travelers and historians. They similarly described Rabat al-Athar in the 7th century as an oratory or a place where people made vows and prayed for the Prophet's intercession. But for the acquirers and patrons, these relics invested their authority in institutions with legitimacy. I already outlined the Fatimid's motivations. On the part of the Mamluks, I attribute the fact that they were non-Muslim, they had non-Muslim slave origins, they were Turkish-speaking foreigners ruling over an Arabic-speaking majority. I kind of attribute that as to why they might have collected relics and built these shrines. And how do we see this play out? I have 1 more minute. Baha'u'ddin was the son of a Christian. He held office under the leadership of Sultan al-Zahir Baybars. This was during the period when we have the emergence of the Mamluk regime and subsequent nation-building campaigns. This was a period when the military and the political systems were being established. Al-Zahir Baybars relocated and reestablished the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo. This was following the Mongol devastation of 1261. And when the caliphs relocated to Cairo, they were descendants of the Prophet's uncle, so there's another connection to the Prophet. They were strictly confined to addressing religious matters, so they were relics of a different sort. Tajuddin, on the other hand, was a vizier under Sultan al-Nasr Muḥammad, who was the most prolific builder in Cairo's history. And al-Nasr Muḥammad encouraged his court to build actively, which might explain why Tajuddin had sort of carte blanche to build this Rabat. Now, using the Rabat as a focus, between its completion in 1307 and the end of the Mamluk Sultanate, 4 consequential Mamluk sultans poured a lot of money into it. And this sponsorship, I see, is a way to offset political instability and power struggles at the time. So what do we have? Sultan al-Sha'ban, who assigned the Shafi'i madhab, he was assassinated. Faraj, who restored the mosque in the 15th century, was held responsible for fiscal financial management. He was also assassinated. The transfer of the relics from Rabat al-Athar by Eluri occurred shortly before the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks and seized their territory. So, and we have to consider one other thing, the emergence of Sayyid Ahmad al-Badawi, the sponsorship and elevation of al-Busiri, of the Burda, the building of Rabat al-Athar, the Rabat's subsequent restoration and confiscation of relics. All of this happened during periods of instability. Now, I'd like to close with an anecdote that might explain my interest in this topic. Number one, this is very much a living tradition. People still visit cemeteries, people still visit shrines, people still pay, in Egypt, still pray for intercession, people still perform ziyarah. But when I was living here as a graduate student, a friend introduced me to the Mawlid scene, if I may use that term. And we followed a well-known sheikh named Sheikh al-Yasim al-Tuhami for several years. And on one occasion, we were in Upper Egypt, I think it was in Kumumbo, and there was this incredible sort of intersection of him singing the words, the verses of Umar ibn al-Farid and other poets who praise the Prophet of Muhammad to this incredible backdrop of an ancient Egyptian temple. And that's something that I think we should not forget. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iman. for this absolutely wonderful presentation. We have time for one question.
Hi. Do you have any idea what happened to the relics in the mausoleum of Eluri? I mean, is it true they went to Samarkand as a gift?
The relics in Eluri? Is that what you asked?
Right.
So they were transferred. They were transferred. I have to put between quotes several times, and it's believed that they're currently in the Mosque of Al-Hussein, not accessible to the public.
Okay, thanks.
Quite quick. There's a virtual question. Great and amazing. I just would like to comment on the place named Athar al-Nabi in Old Cairo. The name is derived from the ancient Egyptian term. I can't really pronounce it correctly. I'm sorry. Itru Nebi? Itru Nebi?
Itru Nebi.
Meaning the Golden Nile, in reference to the source of the Delta Nile, which issues from Manuel Roda. Thank you. This was a comment, not a question. Thank you very much, Iman.